Hello everyone, welcome to the Spirits of Sites, where the darkest stories aren't fiction, they're real. Tonight, we're heading deep into New Mexico, into small towns with secrets the desert tried to bury. These are real events, real people, and stories you won't forget. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. It helps us bring you more true horror from the shadows. Now, let's begin. David Parker Ray lived in Elephant Butte like a man who had made peace with silence. The desert around him was empty, dry, and sprawling, and he seemed to fit into it as naturally as the wind that scraped the dust across the asphalt. People who knew him never thought of him as friendly, but they didn't consider him dangerous either. He was the sort of man who kept to himself, who looked past you rather than at you, who gave the impression of being present without ever truly being there. In a small community where secrets dry up fast, he managed to keep his alive for decades. Elephant Butte was the kind of place where the water glittered brighter than the town itself. The lake attracted fishermen, vacationers, retirees, the sorts of people who wanted a slow, peaceful life. On the surface, it seemed impossible that something monstrous could live in a place like that. But Ray understood something about isolation. Isolation wasn't just useful, it was necessary. It allowed him to operate without interruption. It allowed him to control everything. It allowed him to build the thing he believed the world owed him, a room where he could have absolute power. Inside a nondescript trailer behind his house, Ray constructed an environment that defied comprehension. He called it his toy box, but it was no box and no toy. It was a chamber designed with meticulous cruelty, soundproofed and sealed, filled with equipment chosen not for utility, but for suffering. The air inside was always unnaturally still, as though it held its breath alongside the people trapped there. Chains hung from the ceiling with mechanical precision. A gynecology table sat at the center, its metal straps worn from repeated use. Tools, clamps, saws, syringes, ropes, everything had its place. Nothing in the room existed by accident. Ray kept lists. He kept diagrams. He kept recordings. He wanted control not only over the bodies of his victims, but over their fear, their confusion, and their despair. He recorded a long, chilling message that each victim would hear when they regained consciousness. In the calm, almost professional tone of a teacher or a doctor, he explained to them what would happen next. He instructed them on how they would be kept, how they would be used, how they would be punished. The tape was not the ranting of a deranged man. It was the deliberate orientation of someone who had created his own universe. For years, women disappeared from nearby towns, Truth or Consequences, Albuquerque, Socorro. Many were transient. Many struggled with addiction. Many had left families behind long before they vanished. Society already overlooked them, and Ray understood that. He targeted the forgotten. It is easier to erase someone who has already begun to fade. There were rumors, though. They drifted through the community like dust. Someone thought they heard a woman screaming out by Ray's property one night. Someone else claimed he saw a terrified woman running near the dunes, but convinced himself he imagined her. But in a place like Elephant Butte, people learned not to get involved. The desert had a way of swallowing trouble, and trouble had a way of turning on anyone who challenged it. Ray didn't work alone. Cindy Hendy became his accomplice, and she served as both assistant and participant. Together, they manipulated, captured, and tortured their victims. Hendy later told investigators that Ray claimed to have killed dozens of women, though she couldn't give names or dates. She said that the bodies had been dumped in Elephant Butte Lake, bound in ways that would keep them underwater. Search teams combed the lake repeatedly, but water is an unforgiving archivist. The mud hides what it wants to hide. Everything changed in 1999 when a woman managed to escape. Naked, bruised, and wearing a metal collar locked around her neck, she fled barefoot through the desert and found help. She told the authorities what had happened. At first, officers struggled to believe her. The story sounded too extreme, too grotesque, too impossible. But the injuries on her body, the panic in her voice, and the desperation in her eyes forced them to act. When investigators entered Ray's trailer, they found themselves standing in the center of a nightmare rendered real. Every inch of the room was evidence of long-term planning. The tools were arranged neatly. The restraints were bolted securely. The walls were lined with drawings that depicted scenes of bondage and torture. Worst of all was the audio tape. When they pressed play, Ray's voice filled the space perfectly, as though it had never left. The recording was clinical. It lacked emotion. It lacked haste. It instructed the listener to remain calm. It explained that they would be held for a long time. It detailed what would be done to them, and it made clear that their survival depended entirely on obedience. The more investigators uncovered, the more they realized that they were not dealing with someone who acted impulsively. They were dealing with someone who dedicated his life to systematic brutality. Detectives tried to unravel his past, searching for early signs, but what they found instead were fragments. Stories from childhood acquaintances about Ray's fascination with pornography, with bondage, with control. Nothing stood out enough to predict what he would become, but everything added up to a man who had been constructing this world his entire life. People in Elephant Butte reacted with disbelief. They knew Ray. They'd seen him at the grocery store. He fixed their cars. He waved at them in passing. The idea that this quiet man could be a predator of such magnitude left the town in a sort of moral paralysis. How could evil hide in plain sight for so long? How could no one have known, or worse, had they known on some instinctive level and chosen not to see? During interrogation, Ray was almost relaxed. He suggested that the accusations were exaggerated. He implied that the victims had consented, or that they misunderstood his intentions. His calmness unnerved everyone in the room. It was the calmness of someone who felt no guilt, no conflict, no need to justify anything. He behaved as though the world simply failed to grasp the logic of what he did. Charges mounted quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Hendy, facing her own charges, began to talk. She described the abductions. She described the torture. She described her own role. She led investigators to locations where she believed bodies might be found, but she could not give enough detail. She and Ray had acted together, but Ray had kept deeper secrets even from her. Without concrete evidence of murder, prosecutors focused on kidnapping, conspiracy, and assault. They wanted him locked away forever. They wanted to prevent him from harming anyone else. They wanted justice for the victims whose names they knew and for the ones they would never know. Ray never faced a murder charge. Not because he was innocent, but because his crimes were nearly perfect in their concealment. He died in 2002 of a heart attack just days after sentencing, taking with him every confession he refused to make. The case left scars on New Mexico law enforcement. Detectives and divers spent years searching Elephant Butte Lake, hoping to uncover the truth. But the lake kept its silence. The toy box was dismantled, cataloged, and sealed away. The victims who survived struggled to rebuild their lives, haunted by the memory of that tape, that room, that man. In Elephant Butte, people still avoid talking about him. Even decades later, the locals lower their voices when his name comes up. They don't like remembering that the desert hid someone like him. They don't like considering that evil can be patient, methodical, and invisible until it chooses not to be. Sometimes, when the lake's waterline drops during drought season, people wonder what lies beneath the exposed mud. They watch the shoreline carefully. They try not to imagine bones rising to the surface. But the thought lingers like a bruise beneath the town's collective skin. David Parker Ray lived and operated in a community that trusted the quiet. He used that trust as a shield, crafting a world where he alone controlled suffering. The toy box was not just a room. It was the physical manifestation of a man who believed he deserved dominion over others. And long after his death, the echoes of what happened there have not faded. Elephant Butte will always be a town with two faces, the peaceful lakefront community and the silent shadow that lived inside it. And no matter how much time passes, the memory of the toy box killer remains a haunting reminder that even in the most tranquil places, darkness can thrive unseen. There are places where the desert seems empty, where the wind moves undisturbed across the earth, and where the world pretends nothing has ever happened there. The West Mesa of Albuquerque was one of those places, flat, quiet, and forgettable. A stretch of dry ground on the edge of the city, bordered by new housing developments, scattered tire tracks, and the long, slow creep of suburban expansion. To most people, the mesa was nothing more than an open expanse waiting to be built on. But beneath its soil, the desert held a secret, and for years, it kept that secret with the indifference of a landscape that has buried countless histories. The discovery came almost by accident. On February 2nd, 2009, a woman was walking her dog along a familiar path near the developing subdivision on the mesa. Construction had disturbed the ground. Recent rains had washed away some of the dirt. Her dog tugged at something half buried in the sand, something pale and out of place in the muted earth tones of the desert floor. At first, she thought it might be part of an animal. This was, after all, a region where coyotes and stray dogs roamed. But as she looked closer, dread slid into her stomach like ice. What lay exposed in the dirt was not from an animal. It was human. Within hours, the site was swarming with law enforcement officers. They marked off areas with tape, set up tents, and began the methodical process of excavation. Detectives understood immediately that they weren't dealing with a single accidental burial. The bone was in the wrong place, at the wrong depth, and in a state that suggested long-term concealment. They prepared themselves for something grim, but even so, nothing could have readied them for what they found beneath the surface. One body became 2, 2 became 5, 5 became 11, all women, all buried in relatively close proximity, all carefully placed beneath shallow layers of soil, arranged in a way that suggested intention. The media called the unknown killer the West Mesa Bone Collector, but the nickname felt almost too sensational for something so brutally real. Albuquerque was suddenly the center of a horrifying mystery, one that stretched back years and left behind almost no trace of the person responsible. The identities of the victims began to emerge slowly, like faces rising through murky water. Many were women who lived on the margins, some involved in drugs, some in prostitution, some simply lost in the chaos of difficult lives. A few had families who had reported them missing, others had slipped through the cracks of society without much noise. Their disappearances had been scattered across the early 2000s, a decade when the city's crime rate fluctuated violently and when certain neighborhoods became hubs of danger for vulnerable women. The killer, whoever he was, knew these women. He knew their patterns, he understood where to find them, and he knew how to make them vanish without leaving a trace. Detectives traced the timeline backward. The earliest estimated burials dated to around 2001. The most recent likely occurred around 2005. After that year, the burials stopped. No new graves appeared. The killer had either died, moved away, or found another method of disposing of bodies. But during those 4 years, he had operated with startling efficiency. 11 women buried, all within a relatively small radius, all hidden so successfully that it took years for anyone to stumble upon them. Investigators looked for patterns in the burial positions, the depth, the spacing. They tried to reconstruct the killer's behavior. The graves weren't chaotic. They suggested planning. They suggested a familiarity with the terrain. They suggested someone who understood how long it would take for the ground to settle and how much dirt needed to be moved to conceal a body without attracting attention. The proximity to the developing housing projects raised a chilling possibility. The killer may have chosen the site because he knew it was isolated at the time. He may have believed that the land would remain empty for years, but he miscalculated. Urban expansion crept outward, inching closer to his burial ground until finally the earth betrayed him. When detectives reviewed missing persons reports from the early 2000s, they found connections. Many of the women had vanished from areas along East Central Avenue, a corridor known for prostitution and drug activity. This was where the killer hunted. This was where he searched for victims who might not be reported missing immediately, or perhaps not at all. The women lived precarious lives, making them tragically easy targets. And the killer understood that society's apathy could act as camouflage. Once the identities were confirmed, detectives faced the agonizing task of contacting families. Some families had suspected for years that their loved one was dead. Others had clung to hope. All were devastated by the confirmation. Many asked the question no one could answer: why did it take so long to find them? Police examined the bones for clues. They looked for trauma fractures, knife marks, bullet wounds. But the desert is harsh, and time had eroded much of the evidence. The remains were skeletal, exposed to years of wind, insects, and shifting soil. Cause of death could not be determined for most victims. This was one of the greatest obstacles in the investigation. Without clear cause of death, without physical evidence linking a suspect to the remains, the case grew harder. The list of possible suspects grew, then it shrank, then it grew again. Among them was a man who lived near the burial site during the early 2000s, someone neighbors described as controlling and unpredictable. There were allegations that he abused women, that he had ties to the same world the victims inhabited, but no evidence tied him definitively to the murders. After he died of natural causes, some investigators quietly wondered if the case died with him, but others insisted the evidence was too thin to make such an assumption. Another suspect was a convicted serial killer who had operated in several states and had been active around the time the West Mesa victims disappeared. His history suggested he was capable of these crimes. But again, there was no physical evidence linking him to the Mesa, and his patterns didn't match perfectly. Then there were the unidentified men, Johns, traffickers, pimps, who moved through Albuquerque's underground economy with anonymity. Some women had mentioned them in diaries or conversations before they vanished. Some were rumored to be violent, but none of those leads produced solid answers. The lack of resolution is what makes the case so chilling. A serial killer operated in Albuquerque for years, targeting vulnerable women, burying them in a silent patch of desert, and then disappearing without leaving behind a trail strong enough to follow. It was the kind of crime that felt impossible in the modern era. And yet, it happened. As forensic teams worked the site in 2009, the scale of the investigation grew enormous. Thousands of items of potential evidence were cataloged. Every scrap of clothing, every fiber, every tiny fragment of bone was collected. Anthropologists, archaeologists, and crime scene technicians moved across the mesa in slow, careful sweeps. They sifted dirt through screens, searching for anything that could tell them more about how the women died. The sun beat down. The wind blew dust into their faces. And hour by hour, the ground revealed pieces of the past that should never have been hidden. News coverage exploded. Vigils were held. Community activists urged police to treat missing women's cases more urgently. Families demanded answers. And for months, the West Mesa became a symbol of institutional neglect and human vulnerability. How some people slip through the cracks and how predators exploit that. The placing of the victims' names on memorials across the city became a solemn reminder that these women existed, that their lives mattered, and that someone had stolen years from them. But even as the city mourned, detectives kept working. They dug into the victims' final days. They traced their movements. They interviewed former boyfriends, acquaintances, social workers, police officers, drug counselors, anyone who might have crossed paths with them. They tried to construct a pattern. But each woman lived a complex life, full of shifting friendships and unstable housing situations. The killer had moved among this chaos easily. The women's vulnerabilities were his camouflage. Some investigators theorized that the killer may have been someone known to the victims. Someone trustworthy enough for them to get into a car with. Someone who understood their routines and how to isolate them without raising alarm. Others believed he was a stranger who cruised known areas, picking up women opportunistically. Without DNA or eyewitnesses, both theories remained plausible. Years passed, and the case grew colder. New leads emerged occasionally. Tips from inmates, rumors from the streets, anonymous calls. but none broke the case open. Detectives rotated out, retiring or transferring to new assignments. Fresh detectives took their place, reviewing box after box of evidence, relearning the story from the beginning. Through it all, the Mesa remained silent. But the silence only made the case more haunting. Every time the wind swept across the exposed earth, residents of Albuquerque were reminded that someone had buried 11 women there, believing no one would ever find them, believing they would vanish forever. And for nearly a decade, he was right. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was how it reshaped Albuquerque's sense of safety. People understood, perhaps more than before, how easily someone can disappear when their life has already begun to fracture. They saw how predators exploit vulnerability. They saw how quickly a person's absence can be dismissed as a voluntary departure, a relapse, a lifestyle consequence. The West Mesa showed the city that every missing person deserves immediate attention. It showed families that their fears were valid. It showed law enforcement that patterns exist even in chaos, and that a predator can hide in places everyone thinks they understand. Even now, the case remains officially unsolved. No one has been charged. No definitive suspect has been named. Detectives still receive tips, still review evidence, still hope for a break. But the killer's identity remains a ghost in the city's memory present, but unreachable. The victims' families live with a different kind of silence, one shaped by grief rather than geography. They visit the memorials, they gather at vigils. They tell stories of who the women were before their lives were consumed by hardship. They remind the world that these women had dreams, personalities, and potential. That their lives were not defined by their disappearances. In time, the housing development near the burial site grew. Houses rose, streets were paved, children rode their bikes near the place where the bodies were found. The desert healed over the excavation scars and blended once more into the horizon. But for those who remember, the ground is not just dirt. It is a graveyard of women taken by a killer who moved unseen through the city. The West Mesa Bone Collector remains one of the darkest chapters in New Mexico's history. A case without an ending, a story without a final sentence. A reminder that some monsters are not caught, some crimes do not resolve, and some wounds remain open no matter how many years pass. Beneath the dust of the mesa, the truth still lies somewhere, and until it is uncovered, Albuquerque will live with the knowledge that a killer once walked its streets unseen and may have walked away unseen as well. I remember the first time someone told me about the Torreon cabin. It was late autumn, and the air in the Cibola National Forest held that thin, sharp cold that comes just before the snow. I had stopped at a general store along Highway 337, more out of curiosity than need. The wooden floors creaked under my boots, and the woman behind the counter asked what brought me out that way. When I said I was a writer interested in unsolved crimes, she gave a long, slow look toward the window, as if something beyond the trees had caught her attention. Then she said, "You should ask about the cabin, the one near Torreon. People out here don't forget what happened there." That was the beginning. What hour? I had heard fragments about the case, a murdered couple, a remote cabin, a confession that didn't quite fit. But until that moment, I hadn't realized how deeply the story had embedded itself in the collective memory of the region. Torreon is the kind of place where silence carries weight, where stories pass from one generation to the next, not through newspapers, but through hushed conversations on porches and in kitchens. And as I drove deeper into the forest, toward the place where the cabin once stood, I felt the landscape tightening around me, as though the trees themselves were preparing to speak. The murders happened in October 1982. The victims, a couple named Scott and Melinda, were found shot to death inside their isolated cabin. The scene was brutal in its simplicity. No sign of robbery, no apparent struggle, no clear motive. Just two people, executed in a place meant for refuge. The cabin was tucked away from the road, accessible only by a dirt path that wound through thick stands of ponderosa pine. Anyone who reached it had to know where they were going. When I finally tracked down a retired sheriff's deputy named Ortiz, he agreed to meet me at a local cafe. He was in his 70s, with a weary face carved by sunlight and years of listening to things no one should ever have to hear. He stirred his coffee slowly before saying anything about the case. Then he told me about the night he was called out to the cabin. It was quiet, he said. Too quiet. Forest quiet is different from city quiet. It feels like something is waiting. He described how the responding deputies entered the cabin cautiously, flashlights sweeping across wooden walls and dust-covered shelves. The victims were found in the bedroom. Scott lay near the bed, his body positioned unnaturally, as though he had been caught by surprise. Melinda was closer to the wall, her head turned slightly to the side. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest chaos. The killer had moved quickly and decisively, firing multiple shots at close range. The scene felt personal, intimate, and cold. I asked Ortiz whether investigators had a theory. He paused, considering his words with great care. Plenty of theories, he said, no answers. The investigation progressed slowly in those early days. Journalists swarmed the area, poking around the little communities in the mountains, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Torreon residents grew wary. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. Some people whispered about drug traffickers, others about jealous ex-lovers, others still about random drifters who sometimes wandered through the forest and disappeared just as quickly. But the truth is, Torreon isn't a place where strangers go unnoticed. Whoever killed Scott and Melinda didn't just stumble upon their cabin. They knew the terrain, they knew the couple, or at the very least, they knew exactly where to find them. Weeks passed. Then months. The case grew cold. But cold cases don't stay cold in small communities. They simmer. They become stories people retell, sometimes with slight changes, sometimes with embellishments, sometimes with painful accuracy. I heard variations from nearly everyone I spoke with. Some claimed the couple had been involved in something dangerous. Others believed the killings were random, the work of a wandering predator. Still others insisted there was more to the story, something hidden, something the police never fully uncovered. What complicates the Torreon murders is that a suspect eventually emerged. A young man named Michael confessed to the killings. He was troubled, frequently intoxicated, and prone to telling stories that didn't quite line up. His confession felt rehearsed, shaky, and full of holes. He described events that contradicted the physical evidence. He placed himself in the cabin at times when investigators knew he couldn't have been there. And though he insisted he had shot the couple, he couldn't recall basic details about the scene. I tracked down an old court clerk who had been present during the hearings. She remembered the confession vividly. He was scared, she told me. Not nervous the way guilty people are, but scared like someone who doesn't know what's happening to him. Like a child trying to please the adults. Michael's confession was later withdrawn. Evidence that could have supported it never materialized, and so the case, once again, slipped into darkness. As I dug deeper, piecing together fragments from interviews, police reports, and local folklore, I began to sense a discrepancy, something beneath the surface of the story that no one had quite acknowledged. The cabin itself kept coming up in conversations, as though it held secrets long before the murders took place. People told me the couple had only recently begun staying there full-time. The structure was old, built decades earlier by a man who had vanished mysteriously in the 1960s. Everyone had a different version of why he left. Some said he went to Arizona, others said he died in the forest. No one could agree on the details, but everyone agreed on one thing: the cabin had a history. I visited the site myself. The cabin no longer stands. What remains are the concrete foundation blocks, collapsed timbers, and a rusted metal stove lying on its side like an overturned animal. The forest has reclaimed everything else. Trees grow where the living room once was. Pine needles blanket the place where Scott and Melinda slept. The quiet is overwhelming. Standing there, I felt a strange sensation. Not fear exactly, but an awareness that the place was holding something back. The forest around Torreon has a way of absorbing sound, of making a person feel like they're intruding on something ancient. I took notes. I recorded impressions. I tried to imagine the couple's last moments. But each time I pictured the scene, something felt off. The killer moved too cleanly, too efficiently, too comfortably. This wasn't the work of a panicked intruder. It was something more deliberate. I drove to the nearest town and asked around for information about the couple themselves. Who were Scott and Melinda? What kind of lives did they lead? Had they made enemies? Most people remembered them fondly. They were described as friendly, if somewhat private. They liked the quiet of the forest. They liked the isolation. They weren't the kind of people who brought trouble with them, but someone brought trouble to them. A former co-worker of Scott's told me that shortly before the murders, Scott had mentioned feeling watched. Not overtly threatened, just watched. He had joked about it, brushing it off as his imagination. But everything takes on new meaning when viewed in the aftermath of violence. I tracked down a ranger who had patrolled the area in the early 80s. He remembered the couple well, and he remembered something else too. There was a truck, he said, a blue pickup. I saw it near the cabin once. Didn't think anything of it at the time. Could have belonged to anyone. But investigators never found any mention of a blue pickup in the police reports. No witness statements, no recordings. Nothing but the ranger's memory, preserved over the decades like a fossil. If the truck mattered, no one pursued it. I kept digging. Interviews piled up, notes filled my desk. Still, something was missing. Something central, something obvious. Then it occurred to me, the murders happened quietly. No neighbors heard gunshots. No one saw lights or movement. The couple didn't call for help. This meant one of two things. Either the killer silenced the shots using a suppressor, or the murders happened during a time when no one was close enough to hear. But Torreon isn't a bustling village. It's scattered houses, cabins, and ranch properties. Even on a quiet night, you can hear a gunshot echo across the forest for miles. Someone should have heard. I brought this up to Ortiz. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples like someone carrying a burden far too long. "You're not wrong," he said, "but there's more. Something we didn't make public." He hesitated before continuing. There were footprints outside the cabin. Several, but only one set matched any shoes inside the house. The others, they didn't belong to the victims. This wasn't new. Crime scenes often contain tracks. But it was what he said next that stuck with me. The footprints stopped, right at the tree line. After that, nothing. No continuation. No trail. Like the person stepped into the forest and vanished. Of course, footprints can disappear for 100 reasons. Shifting soil, fallen needles, uneven ground. But something in Ortiz's voice told me he found it unsettling, even after all these years. And he wasn't the only one. A volunteer searcher I met later told me that the forest around the cabin had a strange quality the day they combed it. The air felt heavier than usual, he said. The trees seemed to lean inward. He chalked it up to stress, but I could hear the uncertainty under his words. The deeper I dug, the stranger the case became. Every answer created new questions. Every detail suggested something just out of reach. But one thing became clear: the Torreon murders were not random. They were targeted, precise, intimate. I tried to reconstruct the killer's behavior. They would have had to park the vehicle away from the cabin, approach on foot, enter quietly, and execute both victims efficiently. They would have needed confidence. They would have needed a reason. And perhaps they needed something else, a familiarity with the cabin itself. The retired court clerk told me something near the end of our conversation. It was almost an afterthought, a small detail she assumed I already knew. "You know," she said, "people used to say the cabin was built on old land, sacred land. But people say a lot of things out here. I didn't put much stock into folklore." But voices from Torreon repeated the same sentiment. The land held memories. It held stories. Some of them were violent. Still, I focused on the human side of the case. Someone killed 2 people in cold blood. Someone walked away without being caught. Someone kept a secret for decades. The real question was, why? After months of digging, I found a man who might have held a piece of the answer. He was a distant relative of the cabin's original builder. He lived in a trailer miles away, surrounded by tools, rusted car frames, and old newspapers. He told me that the builder his uncle had left suddenly, not for Arizona, not for a new life, but because he was afraid. Afraid of what? The man shrugged. He said the forest was watching him, he replied. Said he heard things at night. Saw someone near the cabin more than once. When I asked if he believed his uncle, the man hesitated before saying quietly, "Sometimes." I drove back to the cabin site one last time before leaving the region. The forest was hushed, the trees still, as though the world were holding its breath. I stood where the bedroom once was and tried to imagine fear, confusion, pain. But the forest offered nothing. It kept its secrets. In the end, the Torreon Cabin Murders remain exactly what they were on the day they were discovered, a puzzle with missing pieces. A violent act committed by someone who understood how to vanish. A story that refuses to settle. As I walked back to my car, I felt the forest watching. Not menacingly, not maliciously, but knowingly, as though it held the truth somewhere in its roots and soil, knowing no one would ever dig deep enough to find it. And for reasons I still cannot explain, the silence felt almost protective, like the land itself was guarding the final untold chapter of what happened inside that cabin so many years ago. I don't remember the sound of the first shot, at least not the sound itself. What I remember is the way the world seemed to pause, as if every breath in the hallway stalled at the exact same moment. It was early morning on December 7th, 2007. Still cold outside, the kind of cold that makes your fingertips numb and your chest feel tight. The hallways of Aztec High were filled with the usual noises of a school just waking up, lockers slamming, teachers greeting students, backpacks unzipped, voices bouncing off the walls with that half-sleepy energy that belongs uniquely to teenagers. And then everything changed. I was standing near the far end of the main hallway, flipping through notes for a math quiz I wasn't ready for, when a sound cut through the air, not loud enough at first to register as a gunshot, but wrong enough to make my stomach twist. A sharp metallic pop, a muffled thud, a gasp, a scream, and then another shot, this one unmistakable. I didn't know it then, but the boy holding the gun had waited for this morning. He had studied the school's layout, watched students' routines, and planned his way inside with a weapon hidden in a backpack. He was not a student anymore, but he knew the building well, its entrances, its weaknesses, the paths people took when they weren't paying attention. He had come here with purpose, and he stepped into the place we all believed was safe. I remember the moment someone shouted, "Run!" The word didn't feel real. It didn't fit inside the hallway that only minutes earlier had smelled of paper, pencil shavings, and the faint chemical scent of floor wax. Everything felt disjointed, like a dream that had taken a sudden, violent turn. At first, I didn't move. Some part of me still believed this was a drill, or a prank, or something else entirely. But then, another sound echoed down the hallway, louder than before, and the adrenaline hit me like a physical force. My body reacted before my mind did. My books dropped to the floor. My legs started moving. I felt hands grabbing my backpack, shoving me toward a classroom door that was pulling shut. Inside the room, the lights went out, the lock clicked, the blind snapped down. Someone pushed a table against the door. We crouched along the wall farthest from the window. I could hear breathing dozens of breaths, shaky and uneven, filling the dark space. A girl next to me whispered that she had siblings in other parts of the building. A boy whispered a prayer. Someone else sobbed softly, trying to stifle it with their sleeve. In that moment, we were all just voices in the dark, united by fear. My heart hammered so hard, it blurred the edges of everything around me. The teacher was trying to keep us calm, whispering instructions, holding a finger to her lips, but her hand trembled. I could see it even in the dim light. Outside, the footsteps came, slow, heavy, purposeful. They moved down the hallway like the ticking hand of a clock, each step marking a moment none of us wanted to reach. I remember the sound of something being dragged. A backpack, a jacket, a body. I didn't know, I only knew that every sound sharpened the terror inside me. I closed my eyes. I tried not to breathe. I tried to become invisible. People talk about fight or flight, but they don't always mention the third reaction, freeze, the way your limbs lock up, the way time stretches, the way your thoughts become scattered fragments. I froze in that classroom, my back pressed against a wall that suddenly felt thin as paper. Then, just as suddenly, the footsteps moved past our door. A new burst of gunfire rang out farther down the hall. Screams followed. Then, silence. A silence deeper than anything I had ever heard. Hours passed. At least, it felt like hours. It might have been 30 minutes. It might have been 15. Trauma has a way of reshaping memory, taking moments and stretching them until they lose their shape. Eventually, the pounding on the door came. Not the heavy, slow footsteps of the shooter, but the urgent, authoritative bangs of law enforcement. Voices shouted for us to keep our hands visible, to move slowly, to exit one at a time. We shuffled into the hallway with our arms above our heads, stepping around shell casings, desks, dropped textbooks, realizing even as we did so that the world we knew had changed irrevocably. That was when we learned the truth. The shooter was dead by his own hand. But before he turned the gun on himself, he had taken 2 lives. I didn't know them well. I had seen them in passing, exchanged a few words here and there, but I will never forget their names. I will never forget the way people spoke about them, their kindness, their humor, their potential. Their families were left to pick up the shattered remnants of futures stolen in an instant, and I was left with something else. A gnawing question that bore into my thoughts for months afterward. Why? In the days that followed, investigators tried to piece together the shooter's motives. He had been a former student who withdrew into himself after graduation. Online, he had become entangled in extremist forums, dark communities that nurtured hatred and isolation. He had expressed violent fantasies. He had admired school shooters. He had treated the idea of violence as a kind of twisted rebirth. The warning signs were there, but scattered, fragmented, buried beneath anonymity. No one saw everything. No one connected the dots until it was too late. In the aftermath, the town of Aztec became a place of mourning. The high school became a site of tragedy, a building wrapped in ribbons and flowers, its windows glowing with candles during vigils. For weeks, news vans lined the roads. Reporters knocked on doors, people cried openly in grocery stores, and every conversation seemed to circle back to the same words, "We never thought it could happen here." But it did, and the weight of that realization settled over the town like a permanent winter. It took me months before I could walk the halls of the school without flinching at unexpected sounds. Even now, years later, certain noises, fire alarms, footsteps behind me, the slam of a locker, send a spike of panic through my chest. Trauma settles into the body like sediment. Over time, it becomes part of you. People outside the situation often ask why survivors remember the small details more vividly than the big ones. I think it's because the small details are what anchor you. The shoelace dragging on the floor, the flickering light above the classroom door, the smell of someone's peppermint gum. These are the things your mind clings to when everything else dissolves into fear. Healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in pieces, like fragments of a life slowly being reassembled. Friends checked on each other more. Teachers learned to recognize the signs of panic. Parents hugged their children tighter. And somehow, through shared grief, the community found a way to stay upright. But healing isn't the same as forgetting. And forgetting isn't the same as closure. The prosecutor later described the shooter as a young man consumed by hatred and disillusionment, someone who wanted infamy rather than understanding. But labels like that are too clean, too neat. They don't capture the messiness of mental decay, the isolation that festers in silence, the malignant echo chambers of the internet that turn loneliness into fanaticism. What I remember most is the aftermath within myself, the nightmares, the guilt of survival, the sense that every hallway held unseen dangers, every stranger a potential threat. For a long time, I avoided walking past the classroom where the shooting started. I avoided the cafeteria, the library, the gym, the spaces where crowds gathered. I kept my back against the wall whenever possible. My parents wanted me to transfer schools, but I refused. I didn't want the shooter to take more from me than he already had. It took a year before I stopped jumping at every loud sound. It took 2 years before I stopped having weekly nightmares. It took longer before I could tell this story without feeling like my throat was closing. Even now, writing this, my hands shake slightly, not out of fear anymore, but out of reverence for what we lost and what we lived through. People asked survivors what they thought justice should look like, but the shooter died that morning. There was no trial, no answers, no accountability, only absence, only emptiness. Justice, for me, became something quieter. It became the decision to keep going, to honor the lives lost by living mine with intention. It became a promise to notice the people around me, to really see them, hear them, check on them when they seemed distant or withdrawn. I don't pretend that makes everything okay. Some wounds never fully close. Some mornings still begin with shadows. But there is something to be said for survival, not only the act of surviving, but the acceptance of it. For a long time, I felt guilty for being alive when others were not. I carried that guilt like a stone in my pocket, always there, always heavy. One day, a teacher who had also been there during the shooting pulled me aside. She said something I have never forgotten. Living isn't betrayal. It's testimony. She was right. Every day that we continue, every step, every laugh, every mundane moment is a small defiance of that morning. A reminder that the shooter wanted to end more than lives. He wanted to end hope. He wanted to carve fear into the heart of a town. But Aztec is still here. So am I. So are countless others who refuse to be defined by December 7th, even though it changed us forever. The memories remain, the dark classroom, the trembling breaths, the footsteps in the hall, the sirens outside. But alongside those memories are others. Candlelit vigils, embraces between strangers, the resilience of a community determined to rebuild itself. When people ask me now what I remember most about that day, I don't say the gunshots, I don't say the fear, I don't say the chaos. I say this, I remember how we survived. I remember how we held on to each other in the dark. I remember how, even in the midst of terror, kindness carved out a space. I remember how the world broke and how we slowly, painfully, began to assemble it again. That is the truth of Aztec High School. Not just the horror, but the strength that rose from it. And though the hallways are quieter now, though the reminders are subtle and scattered, though the wounds remain, I carry this story with me, not because I want to, but because it is part of who I became that morning. A survivor, a witness, a voice in the silence that followed. And I tell this story so that silence never becomes forgetfulness. I was raised along the Rio Grande in a little adobe house that leaned slightly whenever the spring floods came. My grandmother lived with us, and she used to say the river had moods, some gentle, some wild, some dangerous, and that if you didn't respect it, it would make sure you remembered who it truly belonged to. She would sit in her old rocking chair on the porch in the evenings, the sky burning red and purple behind her, and she would tell stories. Stories about spirits that wandered the desert, stories about the dead who still whispered on the wind, stories that crept into your bones and stayed there. But there was one story she told more than any other, La Llorona. Most people in New Mexico know the tale. They've heard it from parents, from schoolmates, from late-night whispers around campfires along the riverbanks. But the version my grandmother told wasn't the simple one, wasn't the one that ends neatly with a warning for children to behave. No, her version had edges. Her version felt real, as though it had grown from the land itself. And maybe that's because it did. The first time she told it to me, I was 8 years old. I remember the way she lowered her voice, the way her eyes drifted toward the river, the way the wind picked up as though it were listening too. People think La Llorona is just a story, she said, but stories don't come from nowhere. Something happened. Something always happens. I asked her what she meant, but she only smiled, a thin, tired smile that told me she knew more than she intended to share. As I grew older, I learned that tragedies have a way of lingering along the Rio Grande. The river is beautiful, yes, but it is also unforgiving. It has taken lives, accidents, drownings, crimes hidden beneath its surface. And each death leaves a mark, like threads weaving into a tapestry of grief that stretches back centuries. My grandmother said La Llorona walks that tapestry. Her story started long before my time, long before my grandmother's time, even long before our ancestors settled along the water. And yet, somehow, she spoke of it as though she had seen it herself. Her name was Maria, she'd say, though not all versions agree. Beautiful as the dawn, proud as the desert sun, Maria fell in love with a man who admired her beauty but not her heart. He promised her everything, but as time passed, his promises dried up like riverbeds in a drought. He strayed, he lied, he drifted away from her. In the version my grandmother told, Maria's heartbreak twisted into something dangerous. One night, caught between grief and fury, she drowned her children in the river, little ones who trusted her completely, who didn't understand the sudden darkness of the water closing above them. When Maria realized what she had done, she threw herself into the river as well, but the river did not accept her. It returned her to the world, cursed to wander as a spirit, searching endlessly for the children she lost, weeping with a voice that could freeze the blood of any who heard it. La Llorona, my grandmother whispered that night, the weeping woman. But what frightened me more was the way she added, almost in passing, and sometimes she isn't looking for her own children. Sometimes she takes others to replace them. For years, I didn't believe her. For years, I thought the story was just that, a story, until the night I heard her myself. I was 17 when it happened, old enough to consider myself invincible, young enough to wander the riverbanks at night without regard for the warnings my grandmother had repeated for years. It was late September, the monsoon rains had swollen the river, and everything smelled of wet earth. My friend Javier and I walked along the bank, kicking stones, talking about school, about girls, about leaving the valley one day. We weren't drinking that night, weren't doing anything irresponsible except being out too late. We had done it many times before. The river was familiar, comforting even. Its presence hummed like a lullaby. But that night, the river felt different. The air was still in an unnatural way. No crickets, no distant barking dogs, no rustle of leaves, just silence, thick and suffocating. Javier noticed it too. "You hear that?" he asked. I nodded, but there was nothing to hear. Then, faintly, a sound drifted over the water. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low wail, soft and wavering. It rose and fell in a slow, mournful pattern. I froze. Every story my grandmother had ever told flooded back into me. Javier nudged me. "What is that?" Before I could answer, the sound deepened. The cry turned clearer still, distant but unmistakably human. A woman's voice, grieving, lost. "Donde están mis hijos?" Where are my children? Javier went pale. I felt my heart slam against my ribs as the voice echoed along the riverbanks, carried by a breeze that hadn't existed a moment earlier. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "Don't look at her," I whispered, repeating my grandmother's warning. "Whatever you do, don't look." Javier, of course, looked. It started with a gasp, a sharp inhale, as if he'd been punched. His hand tightened around my arm. I turned just enough to see the expression on his face, eyes wide, lips trembling, skin drained of color. The kind of fear that doesn't come from imagination. He didn't finish. Suddenly, he stumbled backward. The ground beneath him gave way slightly, crumbling near the river's edge. The soil was slick from the rain, unstable. Javier fell toward the water, arms flailing. I reached for him, managed to grab his sleeve, but the fabric tore under his weight. He slid into the river with a splash that swallowed the last thing he yelled. I lunged forward, nearly losing my balance too, but managed to brace myself against a boulder. The current was strong, angry, swirling, pulling everything toward the center. Javier surfaced once, coughing, shouting my name. Then the current dragged him under again. I jumped into the water after him without thinking. The cold hit me like a fist. The current spun me, forced me under, pushed mud and darkness into my mouth. I struggled back to the surface, gasping, clawing for something, anything to hold on to. My hands found a root jutting from the riverbank. I clung to it, coughing and shaking, counting the seconds. But Javier never resurfaced. When I finally crawled out of the water, exhausted, freezing, terrified, the voice was gone. The night was silent again, normal, as if nothing had happened. The search teams found Javier's body 2 days later, miles downstream. The official report said he drowned in the current, a tragic accident amplified by recent storms. But I knew the truth, because when he slipped under just before the river swallowed him completely, I heard something else. A whisper close to my ear, a woman's voice. "Uno más," she said, "one more." I didn't tell anyone what I heard that night, not at first, not my parents, not the police, not even my grandmother. But she knew. When I walked into the house after Javier's funeral, she looked at my face and sighed, a heavy, heartbroken sound. "She saw you," she said quietly. I asked her why the spirit took Javier and not me. She shook her head. "Llorona takes who she chooses," she said, "and sometimes she takes the ones who see her. You didn't look, but he did." For years afterward, I avoided the river. Even the thought of it made my skin crawl. But the Rio Grande runs through everything in New Mexico. Through the landscape, the culture, the people. It's impossible to avoid completely. And slowly, over time, I learned to walk near it again, though never at night, never alone, never without feeling a prickle of fear. But the strangest thing is this. The more I listened to others, the more I realized I wasn't alone. So many had stories. Different details, same bones. A fisherman who heard crying near the water just before his nephew disappeared. A woman whose daughter claimed a ghostly figure followed her along a ditch bank. A group of teenagers who swore they saw a white dress floating by the river, but no woman wearing it. A farmer who found small footprints beside his irrigation ditch. Footprints that led to the water but did not return. The legend wasn't isolated. It was woven into the land. And every story shared the same core. A presence near the water, a woman's cry, and a sense of danger that clung to the air like humidity. As an adult, I began researching the tragedies along the river. Real deaths, documented drownings, unsolved disappearances. The Rio Grande has claimed dozens of lives throughout New Mexico. Some wandered too close, some fell. Some were taken by currents far stronger than they looked. And each time I found a story that matched a detail from my grandmother's tales. I felt a chill settle inside me. Was La Llorona a ghost? A spirit? A warning born from centuries of grief? Or was she something else entirely? The collective voice of every tragedy the river had seen. A manifestation of sorrow itself? I don't pretend to know the answer, but I do know this. The night Javier died, I heard something that wasn't human. I felt a presence that wasn't wind or water or fear. Something ancient, something grieving, something that had existed long before I was born. Sometimes, late at night, when the air outside my window is heavy and the house is quiet, I hear faint echoes carried by the river in the distance. Mournful, searching, ¿Dónde están mis hijos? Where are my children? And each time I whisper into the darkness, not here, not mine, leave us be. I don't know if she hears me. I don't know if she listens, but the river listens. The river always listens. And somewhere along its banks, a woman still weeps, wandering, searching, mourning forever the children she lost and the souls she claims along the way. La Llorona is not just a story, she is a memory carved into the land. A reminder that grief has power, a reminder that tragedy lives on through the tales we tell. And for those of us who have heard her voice, her story is no longer a myth. It is a truth we carry with us, whispering at the edges of every dark riverbank, woven into every gust of night wind, echoing through the heart of New Mexico like a cry that will never fade.